9 months after his wife handed him divorce papers she had spent 20 years preparing, Marcus Bennett was sitting on a bench in Piedmont Park in Atlanta, with $2,847 left to his name, and no idea what came next. He had started, with more than that after the collapse, enough to last a careful man, through several months, but 9 months of weekly rent, and cheap food, and the occasional bus fare had ground it down to that number, and he had not found a way to replace what was leaving faster than it came in. A woman pushing a food cart stopped in front of him. She said his name. He did not recognize her. She did not expect him to. But the meal she was about to serve him would unravel a $400 million fraud, bring down the man Marcus had trusted most, and rebuild everything he had lost starting with the one thing money had never been able to buy him. The cart smelled like hot oil, and caramelized onions, and something underneath both of those things, that had no name, but felt like the kitchen you grew up in. The last time she had seen this man, he had $1.7 billion to his name, and a wife on his arm, and a company that employed 480 people across 6 states. Now he was sitting on a park bench in Atlanta wearing a suit that cost $3,800 when he bought it, and had not been pressed in 3 weeks. She knew that face. She had seen it once 9 years ago on a sidewalk in Houston on a day when she had $43 left, and a son who had not eaten since the morning before. Marcus Bennett grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on Bankhead Highway in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta. His father, Gerald Bennett, had come up from Macon, Georgia in 1974, with a cosmetology license, $40 in his front pocket, and a determination that had no name, because nobody in his family had ever had to name it before. You just moved forward. You did not stop. Stopping was for people who had somewhere to fall back to, and Gerald Bennett had nowhere. He opened a barbershop on Joseph E. Lowry Boulevard in 1979, with a borrowed chair, and a second-hand mirror, and 2 clippers he had bought at a pawn shop on Auburn Avenue. The shop was called Bennett's. Not Bennett's Barbershop. Not Bennett's Cuts. Just Bennett's. Because Gerald said, if you had to explain what you did, you were already losing. Marcus grew up behind that counter. He swept hair before he learned long division. He watched his father talk to every man who sat in that chair like that man was the most important person in the room, not because Gerald was performing, but because he believed it. Every man who came through that door had a story. The chair was where the story got told. Marcus learned to listen before he learned to speak. His mother, Dorothy Bennett, worked 26 years as a benefits administrator at Grady Memorial Hospital. She came home every evening at 6:15 and had dinner on the table by 6:45. She did not believe in excuses. She did not believe in complaints. She believed in showing up and doing the work and leaving the space better than you found it. She said that once to Marcus when he was 12, and he never forgot it. Baby, the only people who remember you are the ones whose lives were better because you walked through the room. Marcus went to Georgia State University on a partial scholarship and 2 jobs. Finance major. He graduated with $3,400 in debt, which he paid off in 11 months by living on rice and canned beans, and working Saturday mornings at his father's shop sweeping floors the same way he had done at 9 years old. He started at a commercial real estate firm in Buckhead as a junior analyst. He worked 12-hour days for 4 years, and never once asked to leave early. He understood something most people his age did not. There was a gap between what affordable housing cost to build, and what it cost the federal government to ignore the problem of people having nowhere to live. That gap was where the money was. Not the kind of money that put your face on magazine covers, but the kind that compounded quietly over 20 years and built something that lasted. The federal low-income housing tax credit program offered developers tax credits worth more than the rent itself on affordable housing units. You could build 200 homes for working families, charge rents those families could actually pay, and make your return through credits that institutional investors would purchase. It was not charity. It was architecture. Social architecture. Marcus explained it to his father once, over dinner at the kitchen table on Bankhead Highway. Gerald listened the way he listened to men in his chair, completely, without interrupting. Then he said the only thing he ever said about his son's business. "So you make money by building homes people can live in?" Marcus said yes. Gerald nodded. "That is the only kind of building worth doing." Marcus built Bennett Capital Group, from a one-room office on Auburn Avenue in Sweet Auburn. One desk, one phone, one filing cabinet. He grew it, over 24 years, into one of the largest affordable housing development firms in the southeastern United States. 11,000 units across Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. His name was in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. His face was on the cover of Black Enterprise. He sat on the boards of nonprofits, and banks, and universities. He hired people from the same neighborhoods where his father had cut hair. He married Veronica Hayes when he was 32. She was 29, a corporate litigator at a firm in Midtown Atlanta. She was sharp, and precise, and ambitious, and she spoke about success the way Gerald Bennett spoke about work, like it was not optional, like it was what you did, because doing anything less would be a kind of lying to yourself. Marcus admired her, because she reminded him of the best version of himself. They married in Centennial Olympic Park on a Saturday in October. Gerald was there in his good suit, with his shoes polished. He shook Veronica's hand, and said, "Welcome to the family," and left early, because he had a client at 7 the next morning, because that was Gerald Bennett. Marcus did not see the difference between someone who loved what he had built, and someone who loved what he was worth. By the time he understood the difference, it had cost him everything. 9 years before Marcus Bennett sat on that bench in Piedmont Park, Denise Whitfield was standing on a sidewalk on West Gray Street in Houston, Texas with a folding table, a 2-burner propane stove, a cast iron skillet, and a recipe her grandmother had written on the back of an envelope in 1961. She was 36 years old. Her son, Calvin, was 8. Calvin was sitting on a milk crate behind the table, with a workbook, and a bottle of water, that had been his lunch, because there was nothing else that morning. Denise had $43 in her apron pocket. She had spent $34 of it on chicken thighs, and flour and oil, and cayenne and garlic powder, and the brown sugar, that was her grandmother's secret, and that she told to no one. She had $9 left. If she sold enough plates to cover tomorrow's supplies, she could keep going. If she did not, she would have to call her sister in Beaumont, and ask for something she had promised herself she would never ask for. The chicken was ready. She could tell by the sound the oil made. Her grandmother had taught her that. You do not need a thermometer, baby. You listen. When it stops popping and starts whispering, it is ready. She had 4 plates left when the black SUV pulled up. It was a Cadillac Escalade, the kind that had been detailed that morning. A man got out. Tall, dark gray suit, no tie. He looked like he had just come from a meeting and was already thinking about the next one. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the folding table and the handwritten sign and the skillet, and he did not move for a moment. Then he walked over. He ordered 1 plate, $8. Denise served it in a foam container, with a plastic fork, and 2 napkins, because her grandmother had told her you always give 2 napkins when you're feeding someone you respect. He stood right there on the curb, and opened it and ate. He did not sit down. He did not get back in the car. He ate standing 3 feet from the stove, and did not say anything until he was halfway through the second piece. Who taught you this? He said. My grandmother, Denise said. She's still cooking? She passed 6 years ago. He nodded. He finished the plate. He stood there for a moment looking at the table, and the stove, and Calvin on his milk crate, with the workbook. He reached into his jacket pocket. He put $150 on the table. Denise looked at it. That is too much, she said. It is not, he said. She pushed the money back. He put his hand flat on the table, over the bills, and looked at her. Not smiling. Not performing. Just looking at her the way someone looks at you, when they are trying to say something, that words are too small to carry. He took his hand off the money. He walked back to the Escalade. He did not give his name. He got in, and it pulled away, and Denise stood there on West Gray Street, with $150 on a folding table, and Calvin behind her, with his workbook, and the oil still whispering in the skillet. 6 days later, a paralegal called, from a law office in Houston's Galleria district. A man named Marcus Bennett had paid 8 months of rent on a commercial kitchen space in Midtown Houston. He had also arranged delivery of a used, but fully functional commercial fryer, a prep table, a chest freezer, and a ventilation system. Total cost covered was $21,600. No conditions. No contract. No repayment schedule. There was a note, handwritten on plain white paper, the kind you pull from a printer tray. The paralegal read it over the phone. The food was worth more than what I paid. This is the rest. Denise did not have his number. She did not have his name, until the paralegal said it, and even then she could not find a way to reach him. She had a note, and a kitchen, and equipment she could not have afforded in 7 years of saving. She kept the note. She folded it twice, and placed it inside the envelope, where her grandmother's recipe lived. She carried both for 9 years. She never stopped looking for the man, not actively, not with any plan, but in the way you look for something, when you are always half expecting it to appear. She built everything that came after on the foundation of that afternoon. She built a catering business out of the Midtown kitchen. She built a reputation for church dinners, and community events, and school fundraisers. She hired 2 women from her neighborhood. She sent Calvin to school, with lunches that made other kids ask his mother for the recipe. Then a devastating hurricane came through Houston in the late summer, and took the kitchen, and the equipment, and most of what she had saved, and left her sleeping on her cousin's couch in San Antonio for 3 months. She was not going to rebuild in a city that could flood like that again. She was not going to put everything she had back into something water could take in 48 hours. She made a decision. She moved to Atlanta. She knew no one in Atlanta. She bought a used food cart from a retired vendor in College Park for $3,400. She got her permits from Fulton County. She started selling in Piedmont Park, and on the corner of Auburn Avenue and Boulevard in the Old Fourth Ward. Same food, same recipe, same chicken that Marcus Bennett had tasted once on a sidewalk in Houston 9 years before. Calvin was 17 now, honor roll at Grady High School, talking about engineering school, talking about Georgia Tech, trying not to say it too loud, because his mother had taught him not to promise what you cannot, yet pay for. Denise did not tell Marcus any of this the first day. She set the container on the bench beside him, and said, "Same time tomorrow." She left. He nodded without looking at her. She came back the next day. And the next. By the 4th day he was opening the container, before she walked away. By the 5th he said, "Thank you." The first words he had spoken to her in the park. By the 6th she sat on the bench beside him for a few minutes in silence. By the 7th he told her everything. Raymond Stokes joined Bennett Capital Group in 2011, as Chief Financial Officer. He was 42 years old. He had spent 16 years in commercial real estate finance and structured lending, and he understood capital structures the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He knew where everything connected. He knew where the pressure points were. He knew which cuts would cause bleeding you could not stop. Marcus hired him, because Bennett Capital had grown past what Marcus could manage alone. 11,000 housing units, $1.3 billion in assets, federal tax credit allocations, compliance requirements across 6 states, banking relationships that required constant maintenance. Marcus needed someone who could run the financial architecture, while he focused on the communities those buildings served. Raymond ran it. Carefully, precisely, and in ways Marcus never fully saw. It started in 2016. Raymond began quietly redirecting development capital from affordable housing projects into luxury residential towers in Buckhead, Midtown Atlanta, and one in Charlotte's South End. He did not tell Marcus. He did not need to. The corporate structure gave the chief financial officer authority over fund allocation within approved project categories. Raymond created new project categories. He approved them himself. He filed the paperwork under names that sounded like the mission, names like Old Fourth Ward Affordable Housing Partners and Vine City Community Development Fund. The projects behind those names were $2.3 million condominiums for buyers who had never heard of the neighborhoods the fund names came from. Raymond used Bennett Capital's credit lines to finance these developments. He secured bank loans against the company's existing portfolio, and buried inside the loan covenants were personal guarantee clauses tying Marcus's name and personal assets to every dollar of that debt. Marcus signed the annual filings. He read the executive summaries Raymond prepared. He trusted the numbers, because for 10 years the numbers had always been right, and because trusting your chief financial officer is what you do when you have given someone the keys to the engine and watched it run perfectly for a decade. He did not read the covenants. He did not read the guarantee clauses. When the luxury market softened in 2021, the towers stopped selling. The loans came due. The banks called the personal guarantees. Marcus's assets, the house in Buckhead, the investment portfolio, the retirement accounts, everything was collateral for debt he had not known he was carrying. Raymond had moved his own assets into a blind trust managed in his wife's name 3 years before the market turned. His exposure was zero. Marcus's exposure was everything. The attorneys explained it in a conference room on a Wednesday morning. They used words like cross-collateralization and personal guarantee liability and leveraged exposure. What they meant was that Raymond Stokes had used Marcus Bennett's name and credit and 24 years of credibility to borrow money Marcus never authorized for projects Marcus never approved, and now every dollar Marcus had ever earned was owed to institutions that did not care how it happened. Marcus lost Bennett Capital Group. He lost the house in Buckhead. He lost the portfolio. He lost the retirement fund. He lost 24 years of building something that was supposed to serve people, and discovered it had been hollowed out from the inside by a man who understood that the most dangerous thefts happen where trust is absolute. Veronica filed for divorce 12 days after the company collapsed. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask Marcus how he was holding up. She had a prenuptial agreement that had been drawn up by her own hand 20 years earlier, and she executed it the way she executed everything, with precision and without sentimentality. The agreement protected her personal assets, her partnership earnings, from the firm, the investment accounts she held in her name alone. She had written that document when they were in love, and filed it when love was inconvenient. Their son, Elijah Bennett, 23 years old, and 3 months, into a first job at a financial consulting firm in Midtown, called his mother before he called his father. Veronica controlled the educational trust she had established for Elijah when he was 4. The trust held $2.1 million. Elijah understood the mathematics of the situation. He made his choice accordingly. He did not call his father for 4 months. Marcus left the house in Buckhead with 1 suitcase and $2,847 in a personal checking account small enough that Raymond's restructuring had skipped past it entirely. He drove to Atlanta. He checked into a weekly rental on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in the West End, 2 blocks from where Gerald Bennett had opened his barbershop 45 years earlier. $175 a week. A bed, a sink, a bathroom shared, with 4 other tenants on the floor, a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, where someone had left a plastic chair that sat in the same position every morning when Marcus woke up. He did not know anyone in the building. He had spent 24 years building affordable housing, and had never once sat inside a room that cost $175 a week, and understood what it felt like from the inside. He had built homes for 11,000 families, and now he was paying weekly for a bed in a building that smelled like floor cleaner, and the kitchen someone was always running 2 doors down. He walked to Piedmont Park every afternoon. Same entrance on the 10th Street side. Same path through the great lawn. Same bench near the pond, the third one, from the east, under a pair of oaks, that gave shade, until around 5 o'clock, and then let the afternoon light through in long strips across the path. He sat there, from 3 in the afternoon, until the light changed. He watched the joggers. He watched the families. He watched the food vendors along the main loop, and thought about nothing, and everything at the same time. He had spent 24 years being Marcus Bennett, the name that opened rooms, and filled chairs, and made phones ring. Now the phone did not ring. He checked it out of habit. Nothing. The screen was empty the way a room is empty, after everyone has left, and no one has come back. He did not know what to do with his hours. He did not know what to do with the silence. He had built a company that employed 480 people. Now he sat on a bench and watched the ducks on the pond, and understood for the first time that he had never learned who he was without the company. The company had been the answer to every question anyone ever asked about him, including the ones he asked himself. On the 16th day, a man selling boiled peanuts from a cart near the east entrance walked over to his bench and handed him a cup without being asked. "You look like you need something warm," the man said. That was all. He went back to his cart. Marcus held the cup in both hands for 18 minutes before he opened it. It was the first time in weeks that someone had spoken to him like he was simply a person who might be cold. He called his father that evening. Gerald was 78 years old. Still living in the apartment on Bankhead Highway. Still waking up at 5:30 in the morning out of a habit that decades of early starts had made permanent. Marcus told him he was back in Atlanta. He did not say why. Gerald did not ask. He asked one question. "You eating?" Marcus said yes. Gerald said, "Then you are going to be fine." That was the whole call. He had been sitting on that bench for 23 days, when Denise Whitfield's food cart came down the main path, from the southern entrance. You already know who she is. You already know who he is. What neither of them knew, yet was what the other had survived to become. On the 8th day, sitting on the bench, with an empty container between them, and the late October sun coming through the oaks at an angle, Marcus told her about Raymond. He told her about the shell companies, and the loan covenants, and the guarantee clauses he had signed without reading. He told her about Veronica, and the prenup, and the 12 days. He told her about Elijah, and the 4 months of silence. He told her all of it, and Denise listened the way her grandmother had taught her to listen, when someone was hurting, completely, without filling the space with advice or apologies. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she asked one question. "Do you have the financial records?" He did. He had a portable hard drive in the suitcase at the weekly rental on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. He had kept copies of everything, because it was the habit of a man who had managed $1.3 billion of other people's money, and believed that documentation was the only kind of proof that could not be argued with. He had kept them not as a strategy, but as a reflex, the same reflex that made him check the empty phone. "I know someone," Denise said. Franklin Dupree was 63 years old. He had a small office on Edgewood Avenue in the old 4th Ward, 3 blocks from a mural of John Lewis, and a coffee shop that had been there since before coffee shops were everywhere. He wore reading glasses on a chain, and he ate from Denise's cart every Monday and Thursday without exception, always the breast piece, always extra seasoning, always paid exact change, and told Denise the chicken was better than anything he had eaten in 40 years of traveling for work, and that she should charge more. Franklin was a forensic accountant and fraud attorney who had spent 31 years following money through structures designed specifically to make money disappear. Shell companies, nominee officers, offshore accounts held through cousins and former college roommates. He understood them the way Gerald Bennett understood a man's hairline. You could see everything you needed to know, if you looked at the right place. Denise brought Marcus to Franklin's office on a Tuesday. She did not call ahead. She brought 2 containers of chicken, and walked into the waiting area, and set one on the reception desk, and carried the other to Franklin's door and knocked. Franklin looked at Marcus. He looked at the hard drive. He waved them both in. Franklin read through the files for 31 minutes without speaking. He put his glasses on. He took them off. He stood up, and walked to the window, and stood there for a moment looking out at Edgewood Avenue. Then he turned around. "This is not a bankruptcy case," Franklin said. "This is a criminal case. Those are different things. And the difference is measured in federal prison terms." He explained it, without using language that required a law degree. When a company fails, because the market turns, or because leadership made poor decisions, that is a business matter. When a chief financial officer creates shell project entities, redirects investor capital into those entities for his own benefit, files false allocation reports with federal regulatory bodies, and buries personal guarantee clauses in loan covenants that the principal officer never reviewed or authorized, that is wire fraud. That is securities fraud. That is theft with paperwork. The documents on that hard drive show intent. They show a pattern. They show a system. And systems like this do not happen by accident. Franklin took the case. He made one call the afternoon Marcus, and Denise left his office. The person on the other end had been building a file on irregularities in the southeastern affordable housing tax credit market for 2.5 years, and had been unable to find a victim willing to come forward with documentation. Most victims of financial fraud do not know they are victims. They believe they failed. They believe they were unlucky. They believe the market moved, and they were caught on the wrong side of it. They do not believe someone stole from them because the theft was constructed to look like misfortune. Marcus had the documentation. Franklin had the expertise. The SEC's Atlanta regional office had the jurisdiction. Within 96 hours of Franklin's initial filing, a forensic audit team was assigned. They began tracing the fund flows from Bennett Capital Group through a network of 8 shell entities registered in Delaware. Each entity had a name designed to sound like community development work. Old Fourth Ward Community Partners, Grant Park Affordable Housing Fund, Vine City Residential Development Group, Pittsburgh Neighborhood Revitalization Trust. Behind each name was a registered agent, a mailbox, and nothing else. Raymond Stokes had moved $63 million through these entities over 6 years. He had purchased luxury investment properties in his wife's name, and in the names of 2 associates, who were his former college roommates. He had also made representations to 4 outside investors, who had pledged personal assets as collateral for housing developments that Raymond had never intended to build. Total victim exposure across all parties was $217 million. The investigation reached Veronica 36 hours after it began to focus on the trust instrument she had created 5 years before the divorce. The forensic team identified the document in the first batch of records subpoenaed from Raymond's office. It was a trust managed by Raymond Stokes as co-trustee and investment manager. The trust held $2.7 million of Veronica's personal assets. The trust was referenced in the prenuptial agreement she had written herself, the same document that had protected her when she left Marcus. The connection was not itself evidence of criminal conspiracy, but it demonstrated that Veronica had a direct financial relationship with Raymond Stokes that predated the divorce, that she had entrusted her own assets to the man who was simultaneously defrauding her husband, and that the legal structure protecting her had been created during the same period Raymond was building the structures designed to destroy Marcus. The timing was not coincidence. The structure was not accident. Veronica retained a criminal defense attorney within 36 hours of the SEC's initial contact. She did not call Marcus. She did not call Elijah. She called a partner at Holland and Knight on a Saturday morning, and by Monday she had a full legal team. Elijah found out, through a Wall Street Journal alert on his phone. A brief item about an SEC investigation into Bennett Capital Group and related entities. He read it twice. He saw his mother's name in the third paragraph. He saw the trust. He saw the dates. He sat at his desk in the consulting firm's Midtown offices, and held his phone, and did not move for 14 minutes. Then he called his father. Marcus picked up on the second ring. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence was the kind that holds everything that should have been said over 4 months of not calling. "Dad," Elijah said. "I did not know." Marcus closed his eyes. He did not say it was all right. He did not perform forgiveness. He said, "I know," and he meant it. He had spent 24 years building homes for families, and he understood that the structures people build around themselves are not always the structures that keep them safe. Elijah had protected himself by choosing proximity to money. It was a calculation. Marcus did not blame him for the math. He blamed himself for building a life where the math was all that was left to do. Raymond Stokes was arrested on a Thursday morning in his new office in Buckhead, where he had set up a private investment advisory firm 4 months after Bennett Capital collapsed. He was escorted through the lobby in front of his assistant and 2 clients, who were waiting in the reception area. A photographer was already on the sidewalk outside. Raymond did not look at the camera. He looked at the pavement the way you look at the ground, when you are finally understanding that every move you thought was smart has a last move, and this is it. In the processing room at the Federal Building downtown, Raymond sat with his attorney on one side, and the weight of what he had done on the other, and for the first time in 5 years there was no structure to hide behind. There were no shell companies between him and the consequence. There were no nominee officers, no Delaware registrations, no trusts in other people's names. There was just a man sitting in a chair, who had spent 5 years taking the labor of thousands of families, who needed affordable homes, and turning it into investment properties in his wife's name. He had told himself it was strategy. He had told himself Marcus would never have built at the scale Raymond knew the company could reach. He had told himself the fraud was temporary, that he would repay it when the luxury market recovered, that the shell companies were a bridge, not a theft. He had told himself all of this in the private language of a man who is very good at constructing explanations that sound like reasons. In that processing room, none of the explanations worked anymore. They had stopped working the moment the forensic team found the fund transfer records, the fake project filings, the personal guarantee clauses buried in language Marcus would have had to read 40 pages of loan covenant to find. Raymond had known Marcus would not read 40 pages. He had built his entire plan on that knowledge. On knowing which man Marcus was, on knowing that Marcus trusted people he had reason to trust, on knowing that the gap between Marcus's attention and the documents Raymond controlled was wide enough to drive $63 million through. Raymond sat in that room, and for the first time he did not think about what he had gained. He thought about what Marcus had lost. He had known Marcus for 13 years. He had been in Marcus's home. He had sat at Marcus's kitchen table. He had shaken Gerald Bennett's hand at the company Christmas party, and heard Gerald tell his son, "You build homes people can live in. That is the only kind of building worth doing." Raymond had heard that sentence and understood it, and then done the opposite of everything it meant. He had used the infrastructure of building homes people could afford to build luxury properties that priced those same people out of the neighborhoods where Marcus was trying to serve them. He had done it with Marcus's name. He had done it with Marcus's credit. He had done it with the trust of a man who believed that the people around him were there because they shared what he was building, not because they were planning to dismantle it from inside. Raymond Stokes did not cry in that processing room. He was not that kind of man. But there was a moment, sitting there before his attorney started talking, when he thought about a conversation he had with Marcus in the early days, 2012. They were driving back from a site visit to a 140-unit development in East Point. Marcus had been quiet for most of the drive, and then he said, "You know what my father told me once?" He said the only way to really know a man is to watch what he does with something that belongs to someone else. Raymond had nodded, and said that was a good way to look at it. He had meant it at the time. He could not explain when he had stopped meaning it. The building was on Auburn Avenue in the Sweet Auburn corridor, 4 blocks east of the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, and 2 blocks from the church where Dr. King had preached. A former dry goods warehouse. 2 stories, 11,000 square feet, empty for 6 years. The owner was a holding company that had been trying to sell at a price the neighborhood could not meet, and losing money on the carrying costs every quarter. Marcus offered $1.6 million against an asking price of $2.4 million, and the holding company accepted, within 10 days. He had the plans drawn by a woman named Patricia Graves, who ran a small architecture practice on Edgewood Avenue, and had grown up 3 streets from the site, and understood what the neighborhood was, and what it was trying to remain, and what it was in danger of losing. The Whitfield Bennett Community Kitchen. A food hall on the ground floor, with 13 vendor stalls. A shared commercial kitchen on the 2nd floor, with professional equipment available to permitted vendors, who could not afford their own setup. A business incubator on the 3rd floor offering accounting support, small business banking access, lease negotiation guidance, and mentorship for food entrepreneurs, who knew how to cook, but had never filed a business tax return, or applied for a commercial loan. Marcus showed Denise the plans on a Wednesday evening at her kitchen table. Calvin was in the next room. Marcus unrolled the blueprints between the salt shaker and a stack of Calvin's school papers. Denise looked at the layout. She looked at the name printed across the top. She was quiet for a long time. "You are putting my name on this building," she said. "Your food put me back on my feet," Marcus said. "Your name goes first." He had said Whitfield Bennett, not Bennett Whitfield. Her name first, his second, because she was the one who had shown up with a plate of chicken, and no expectation of anything in return, and that is the kind of act that deserves to lead. Denise put her hand flat on the blueprint the way Marcus had once put his hand flat on a folding table, over $150 on a Houston sidewalk 9 years before. Same gesture. Different city. Different decade. Same meaning. Marcus established a scholarship fund for the children of food vendors and small food business operators in the city. $60,000 a year, enough to provide annual support for 5 students at Atlanta University Center schools. Calvin Whitfield was the first recipient. His acceptance letter came from Morehouse College, engineering program, with a merit component on top of the scholarship. He read it at the kitchen table. He looked at his mother. Denise looked at her son. The letter sat between them on the table next to the blueprints, and the salt shaker, and the stack of school papers. Everything real happening at a kitchen table the way it always had. Elijah Bennett came to the opening, without calling ahead. He took the MARTA from Midtown, got off at the King Memorial Station, and walked 7 blocks north on Boulevard to Auburn Avenue. He stood on the sidewalk outside the Whitfield Bennett Community Kitchen, and looked at the sign on the building for a long time. His entire life he had seen his father's name first on everything. Bennett Capital Group. Bennett on the letterhead. Bennett on the building directory. His father's name first always, because his father had built it, and it was his. Not here. Here his father's name came second. Behind a woman Elijah had never heard of. Behind a name he was reading for the first time. He stood on that sidewalk and understood something he had not understood in the 4 months he had spent not calling. The man who had always needed to be first, who had always needed his name to open the room, before he walked into it, that man had decided to put someone else's name in front of his own. That was not a small thing. That was not a PR gesture. That was a man who had lost everything, and come back understanding something different about what things were worth. Elijah walked in. The ground floor was full. 13 vendor stalls, communal tables, the smell of frying chicken, and collard greens, and roasted peppers, and rice filling the room, from the brick walls to the high ceiling. People were in line. People were eating. People were talking to vendors they had just met like they were people they had always known. Elijah found his father in the kitchen behind Denise's stall. Marcus was wearing a white apron, with oil on the front, and flour on his forearms, and he was lowering chicken into the fryer, with a pair of tongs, with the economy of motion of someone who had done this enough times to stop thinking about each individual step. Elijah stood in the doorway. Marcus looked up. He saw his son. He did not say anything. He looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back to the fryer. Elijah stood in the doorway for 2 minutes. The oil crackled. The exhaust fan hummed above them. Denise moved past him, with a tray, and a word for a vendor 2 stalls down. Nobody directed Elijah. Nobody told him to come in, or stay out. He walked to the counter. He found an apron on the hook by the hand-washing station. He put it on. He stood next to his father. He did not say "I am sorry." He did not try to explain 4 months of silence, with a sentence. He just stood there. Marcus did not look at him. He held out the tongs. Elijah took them. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, frying chicken and plating orders, and wiping down the counter between rushes, not talking, not needing to, the way Gerald Bennett had once worked next to his own son in a barbershop on Joseph E. Lowry Boulevard without explaining love, because love was the presence, love was the staying, love was showing up, with your hands, and doing the work, until the silence between you stopped being absence, and started being something else. The restitution came through on a Friday. Franklin called Marcus at the weekly rental on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive and told him to come to the office on Edgewood Avenue. Marcus walked the 11 blocks. He had gotten used to walking. Franklin had a folder. Raymond Stokes had been convicted on 13 counts of wire fraud, 5 counts of securities fraud, and 3 counts of money laundering. His personal assets had been seized and frozen, including the properties in his wife's name, which the court had determined were transferred, with knowledge of the fraud. The total recovery from all seized assets was $71 million distributed across all identified victims proportional to documented losses. Marcus's share was $29 million. It was not $1.7 billion. It was not close to $1.7 billion. But Marcus was not the same man who had needed $1.7 billion. He was a man who had learned to fry chicken. He was a man who had sat on a milk crate next to a 17-year-old boy, and explained revenue, and fixed costs, and profit margin using a food cart as the example. He was a man who understood what it meant to earn $700 standing over a fryer in Atlanta summer heat for 11 hours, because he had done it. He looked at the number, and thought about his father counting out $40 a month into a savings account for decades, without telling anyone, giving up coffee and lunch so his son could go to school without debt. $29 million to the man Marcus Bennett was becoming was enough. It was more than enough. It was the foundation of something real. Veronica did not come to the opening of the Whitfield Bennett Community Kitchen. She did not call. Her story had its own ending in a midtown apartment, with a suspended law license, and a phone that had gradually gone quiet in a different way than Marcus's had, not all at once, but slowly, as the calls, from partners and clients and friends who sat on the same board stopped coming in. Not everyone returns. Not every thread gets tied. That is not a failure of the story. That is simply what happens, when what held something together was never what either person thought it was. Denise Whitfield had carried a handwritten note folded inside a grandmother's recipe for 9 years, through a hurricane, and a cross-country move, and 3 years of pushing a cart, through Atlanta rain, and summer heat. She had carried the belief, protected by that note, that a stranger could be kind, without wanting anything back. That belief was the only thing she owned, that no storm could touch. When she saw the man, who had written, that note sitting on a bench, with nothing, she did not calculate what he was worth. She calculated what he needed. A plate of food. Someone to show up the next day, and the day after that without asking for an explanation. Some people protect themselves with prenuptial agreements and offshore trusts and shell companies built in other people's names. Some people protect themselves with a recipe written on an envelope in 1961 and a belief that kindness is not a transaction. Every one of these is a kind of armor. The armor that Raymond Stokes built protected him until the moment it did not. The armor that Veronica built protected her until the thing it was protecting no longer existed. The armor that Denise built cost nothing and weighed nothing and was the only thing in the story that stayed standing when everything else fell. The tools that build communities and the tools that hollow them out from inside are often identical. The difference is in the hands holding them. Raymond Stokes and Marcus Bennett had access to the same financial instruments, the same tax credit structures, the same development frameworks, the same legal architecture. One used those tools to build 11,000 homes for families who needed them. The other used them to steal from the man building those homes and from the communities those homes were meant to serve. The tools are not the answer. The tools never tell you who someone is. The way they use them does. Marcus Bennett had $1.7 billion and lost it. He had a wife who left in 12 days. He had a son who chose the money. He had a partner who took everything he had built and used it to take everything else. And the person who found him was a woman he had met once on a Houston sidewalk, who remembered what he had done with $150 and a handwritten note, and who showed up 9 years later with a plate of chicken and said, "Same time tomorrow." The people who leave when you have nothing were never there for what you thought they were. The people who show up with a plate of food and no expectation of anything in return, those are the ones who were always really there. You just could not see them when the room was full and the name on the door was yours. You only see them when the room is empty and they are the only ones standing in the doorway. If someone showed up for you after all that time, not because they owed you, not because they wanted something back, but simply because they remembered what you did when they had nothing, would you trust it? Or would you spend your time trying to figure out what they wanted? Leave your answer below. This one is going to divide the room. If this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when nobody else did, send it to them right now. They probably do not hear it often enough. Subscribe. See you in the next one.
If this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when nobody else did, send it to them right now. They probably do not hear it often enough. And if you are still watching, drop a comment and tell me what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you are from.
Hit subscribe and turn on the bell because tomorrow's story is one you simply cannot miss. See you in the next one.